costs of Europe. They lied about Turkey's entrance to Europe. They lied about the European army because we've got a veto over that. They've put these in their leaflets. And they've lied about this here tonight too. And it's not good enough. You deserve the truth. You deserve the truth.
Welcome to all of you. What a great way to start this, and thank you very much. This is, of course, the great Scot, as she was introduced, Ruth Davidson, leader of the Scottish Conservative Party. I'm Margaret Brennan. I'm the White House and Foreign Affairs correspondent for CBS News, and I'm so glad to be here to talk to you tonight. There's no shortage of things that people are talking about when they're talking about this city, this center of politics right now, and I want to sort of start with where people's minds are right now, which is the connection, alleged or otherwise, between Moscow and Washington. These reports in regard to the aides around President Trump and their contact with Russian officials. This is something when I travel the world, I hear leaders raise a lot of concerns about. What is this viewed as from your perch overseas?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things to say is when I started talking to the producer this morning, we had a call sort of before work to say, look, here's what we want to talk about tonight. We want to tell people that are coming along. And the real hot topic coming out of the White House is the links to Russia. By this evening, by the time we came here, President Trump has just said that he was no longer committed to a two-state solution in between Israel and Palestine. So that's how quickly things are changing in world politics right now. Absolutely reversing and flipping on its head decades worth of diplomacy. But I think there's concern. There's real concern about electronic expansionism from Russia. Not only suggestions that there were attempts to influence or change the US election, but we're hearing sustained reports now out of France. They've got a presidential election this year in the coming months, that there are attempts from Russia there. And at the moment, from the UK, we've always seen America as being a very strong, a very reliable ally. And now, even after only 26 days, or however long the tenure has been so far in Pennsylvania Avenue, we're beginning to reassess how reliable an ally the United States is. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge change in Europe. That's a massive, massive shock.
And yet, when Theresa May, the Prime Minister, came here and the first leader to walk into the White House and stand beside President Trump, the message was nothing's changed. The allies are as strong as they ever have been. That was a difficult message for her to sell back home?
Well, I think, first of all, the UK's always found itself as in quite an odd position, and quite often we've seen ourselves as the sort of broker between old Europe and the Anglo-Saxon axis between the UK and the US, a sort of transatlantic bridge, if you like. And there have been times in our recent political history where there's been a sort of symbiosis between the UK leader at number 10 Downing Street and the US president in the White House. And I think probably the best examples have been sort of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, who had a very close relationship, and also to a degree Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. At both times you had the leaders in both offices who had similar political philosophies, similar worldviews, and had common and shared foreign policy goals, and worked together very, very clearly with that. I think what's a reassessment that we're having to make is that even in the Obama administration, where he said that his stated preference was to pivot away from Europe and to pivot onto looking at Asia Pacific, and understandably so with the rise of China and etc. While that may have been quite hurtful for people that have been long-term allies in the UK, there was still a sense that the US wanted to be part of the multilateral institutions that they'd helped build, that they were a full and willing partner, that they sent serious people to the United Nations, to NATO, and that they wanted to have multilateral solutions to the world. We're now seeing a personality in the White House who is kind of living his own business philosophy, which is about being bilateralist. So it's about the art of the deal. It's like, let's shake hands one on this, and I'll grab your hand and I'll pull it over here, and we'll see what happens. And again, that's a realignment in world politics too. So I think it was important for Theresa May to go over there to try and act as that kind of bridge, because there is unrest within Europe about the current incumbent on the White House. And she did manage to get several quite welcome sort of things put on the table and done in that meeting. So for those of you who remember the joint press conference, she stood up there and got the US president, said that, commitment to NATO, we're going to, after he called it obsolete, talking about the 2% in terms of the payment that's going in, it's the cornerstone of defence, and he stood there and nodded along. And actually that was quite important for her to be able to get that concession out of the president and be able to take that back to colleagues and allies in Europe as well. So that was quite an important one.
Well, and that message, I think the administration is trying to send now, having sent Defense Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of State, and other very key officials, including the Vice President, to try to reassure Europe. But Secretary Mattis said today, in regard to NATO, which you just mentioned, and he put it in pretty stark terms, but massaged it diplomatically, but basically said, we can't care about your kids more than you do.
Yeah, and we can't pay for it.
If you're worried about defense in Europe, you need to make good on your 2% of defense spending, of GDP on defense spending every year.
And the way in which he said that will probably have been quite shocking to some people around that table. From a British point of view, actually, we probably wouldn't have that much problem with that on the grounds that we're one of only 5 of the NATO members that actually meets their 2%. So in terms of the people that are sitting around that table, you're right, there's folk there that we've been trying to get them to pony up a bit more cash for a number of years as well.
Is it the way that it's said? Because the message you're saying in the UK isn't actually that disruptive. You would like to see more European partners pay up.
Well, what I think was important was that people believe it. What's worrying is that what he said the stick was we might reduce our own obligations. Now that is quite frightening, particularly when you've got a very activist Russia on the borders of the east of Europe. But what he said about you've got to pony up the money was absolutely right, and others have been saying that within the NATO alliance. What was important as well was what he briefed before he stood up to speak, which was we are utterly committed to this. What was said during the election when Trump was saying that NATO was obsolete, that you'd pull America out of it, that is not happening. He as a former general, he as the defense secretary, is saying that they see that, they want to be part of it, but what they're saying is pull your weight. Well, I'm not sure there's many in the UK that have got many problems with that, if I'm honest.
Right. Well, and President Obama basically said that in softer terms himself. But when it comes to the bigger question of where the UK fits in that European picture, the calculus is getting a bit more complicated as you head towards Brexit, though we are still, timeline-wise, 2 years out, roughly, from a full divorce.
Sure, the timeline is set out by Europe, so whenever the British move Article 50, which is going to happen by the end of March, there is a clock that starts ticking, and by the end of 2 years, that's it done. There's no do-over, there's no sort of extra time. It's not like your Super Bowl. We don't get any extra. We don't get any extra. That's it, we're done.
But does that in any way handicap or tie the hands of Theresa May when it comes to delivering the kind of perhaps tough words that a UK ally to the US, like Margaret Thatcher, had been able to deliver in private before?
Well, I don't think, knowing Theresa May as well as I do, and I've known her for a number of years, that she's the sort of person that minces her words at all. She's a very strong figure. She's very reserved. She's not the sort of figure that's going to kind of go in for small talk or bonhomie or anything like that. But she will be absolutely true to her words. She may not say many of them, but she means every single one, and they're very well chosen. And I think what's quite unusual about her, and what has caught maybe the media in the UK a little bit by surprise, is the way in which she makes decisions. And it's quite, in many senses, in a world of 24-hour news, and your network wouldn't particularly like this, is that it's quite considered. So she will take information from lots of different areas and then make a decision. She's not going to have a microphone stuffed under her nose and pivot immediately to an answer without having checked it out and then maybe roll back or whatever. She would rather...
Are you saying something about American politicians when you say that?
No, I mean, I'm saying it about the UK too, and that the kind of Americanization of politics and news is such that we've been there too. And I think there was quite a lot of surprise when she took over last summer that there wasn't a kind of media plan for a photo op a day for the first 100 days. She's more of I think she's been nicknamed a kind of submarine prime minister, in that she rises to the surface to say something of import and then sinks back down again, and then comes back up and does the same. So, but a very thoughtful woman, and very robust woman, very tough woman.
I want to ask you, because as much as we're all trying to figure out what's happening in the political environment here, there are a lot of challenges within Europe, and you mentioned them right at the top in terms of, are you looking at a populist movement, as some have characterized it, whether it's Brexit or what you're looking at in terms of upcoming elections in the Netherlands and France and Germany? Or are you looking at something perhaps a bit more sinister, as has been implied in the past, in terms of direct Russian interference to destabilize democracy?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that it has to be an either or. I think that there absolutely is a rise of popular nationalism in a number of countries around the world. You're seeing Geert Wilders from the far-right Freedom Party, who's leading the polls in the Netherlands, which is the next European nation that goes to the polls. A couple of months after that, you've got Marine Le Pen from the far-right National Front National, who's leading the polls there. You've also got, for the first time this week, Angela Merkel is dropped to second in the polls in Germany. Now, if there were to be a change in the head of the Reichstag, the chancellorship, that would be a real moment of pivot in European politics, because she's been such a solid presence, for over a decade now. So if there was that change and Martin Schulz is really moving the polls there, then I think that would be a big kind of shock. The shock waves to Europe would be quite big there too.
But what do you attribute that destabilization to, as some have? I mean, is it something to be feared, truly? You've been characterized yourself as sort of an unconventional politician. You had this meteoric rise, coming to power in a very quick way. Age 32, you were elected for the first time. In 6 months, you became party leader. Being unconventional and not being of that world can be an asset. Is it inherently a threat?
I mean, I think I would kind of take issue with the premise of your question, in that one of the reasons that since I became leader of my party, the party has gone through a renaissance, apart from fantastically charismatic leadership. Apart from that, one of the reasons is that we've stood very squarely against a nationalist movement in my own country. So we had a referendum 2 years ago about whether Scotland would secede from the United Kingdom, and I was one of the kind of leading voices against that. As you saw from the right. film as well, I was very much against Brexit. I'm a big fan of wider unions and tend to argue for them, to be part of them quite a lot. So in a sense, I'm kind of counter to that. And in my own story, although I'm not what you would have expected a conservative necessarily to be, if you were a lazy member of the media. The idea that I'm something completely other is wrong, because I worked for 10 years as a journalist for the BBC and for others, and was interviewing politicians every day. So I wasn't completely foreign to the world. It wasn't like a bunch of one step away from white supremacist bloggers that are living just up the street. And it turns out they're quite chaotic,
But, I appreciate you defining yourself. Unconventional, though certainly not those terms you just threw out there. But can you say, though, because you had the President of the United States stand up there today and once again repeat the idea that the media are generating fake stories and that the media are part of the problem. When you say things like you just said, what are you basing that calculus on? What made you come to that conclusion that that's who is sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, I think Mr. Bannon probably wouldn't be far away from describing himself as that, to be fair. I think as well that we have to be very careful about popular nationalists, populist strongmen, part demagogues, using a lot of their political capital at the beginning of their journey to delegitimize public scrutiny, which is what demonizing the media does. And I think that if we learn our lessons from history, there is a very strategic reason why you do that. And I think that should worry us all.
Steve Bannon and those around him would strongly disagree and have said that's all made up and that's not fair. The associations with Breitbart. But it's interesting that you watching from your perch, that's how you perceive the leadership here right now. Well,
I think it's quite chaotic, and I think that while I absolutely understand the kind of almost primal scream from people that feel miles from politics, who feel like they're not represented, who feel that their life has gotten worse, not better, with globalism, with post-crash, all the rest of it, wanting to latch on to somebody who says that they will challenge the status quo that is not benefiting their lives. I absolutely understand that. But I also would argue against the idea that having people that don't understand politics, and while there's a huge backlash against professional politicians, it doesn't mean you shouldn't have professionalism in what you do. And I think that if you've got a situation where you've got, there's a reason that the Founding Fathers and the changes to American politics means that you have a transition period, so you don't enter office the day that you win the election and all the rest of it. And I look at what's happening here, and within the first 30 days, you've got a Labour Secretary withdrawing himself from nomination. You've got a intelligence, a head of intelligence that's having to stand down. This is chaotic, and it's chaotic because there's a lack of professionalism and moral seriousness, and that is a worry too. I mean, I think the one thing, and I was chatting to a couple of members that are in the audience, including Congresswomen, and saying one of the things that we really appreciate when we look at America right now is how strong your institutions are. So when the travel ban came in, absolutely, and the way in which you see the executive branch being tempered by the courts, by the legislature, and all the rest of it. And your founding fathers knew their stuff, probably because 9 of them were Scots. So
But so you didn't think it was a good idea for Theresa May to have invited Donald Trump to come to the UK? There's an invitation to meet with the Queen.
Yeah,
There's also been some talk about addressing Parliament.
I mean, what I said was the whole point of state visits is that it's about honouring sort of people that share your philosophy, your friends, and all the rest of it. The difference from just a bilateral summit or whatever. And I think that what I had a problem with was the idea that could go on where there were members of my own country that were being banned from this country. People with joint passports and all the rest of it. In a sense, as a citizen of the United Kingdom, I am less worried about the personal relationship between Theresa May and Donald Trump as people. What I worry about is about the relationship between the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the President of the United States, and the relationship between our two countries, which has existed and will exist, no matter who's in the Oval Office, and no matter who's in 10 Downing Street. So I will extend, and I'm sure the government of the United Kingdom will extend every courtesy to the President of the United States when he arrives, as you should with any world leader. But we're going to want to make sure that any deals that are done, he's going to honour. And we have to be sure of that.
President Trump is Scottish.
President Trump is half Scottish. We've had run-ins with President Trump before, and even in my legislature in Scotland.
Exactly. And I've heard from other European diplomats in the past, they look at his business interactions and say they think that's how he applies that to how he views things now as President of the United States in terms of some of the difficulties in Scotland and Ireland.
We've got a countdown clock. I'm aware I'm first up, so I'm going to be really quick with this one. My fiancée is Irish, and when I go over and meet her family in Ireland and all the rest of it, they're very proud of John F. Kennedy being Irish, and when he was president going over, and they still point out in Ireland, and JFK came here and JFK went there. We don't do that in Scotland. But when he was building a golf course, one of the 2 golf courses that he owns he bought one and he built one. The one that he built, he got into a really big fight with the First Minister of Scotland about a wind farm that was offshore that was going to spoil the view of his golfers. And he was invited to come and give evidence to a committee at our Parliament. And it was a bit of a circus. He brought a whole sort of entourage with him. And because we have a kind of healthy respect and disrespect in Scotland. We have a strange way of being very open and talking about stuff and being a little bit sort of cocking a snook at people in positions of powers. When he was marching into the Parliament with all of his entourage and all the TV cameras and all the rest of it, there were a couple of people there who had thought to bring with them balloons that they'd rubbed on their thighs and held above his head. So if you do a Google search for Donald Trump, Scottish Parliament, you will see pictures of his hair just going like like this, which isn't the most mature way to conduct politics. And I have to say there were no elected officials involved, but I can't say nobody had a smile. One thing I would say just before we go, and we are out of time, is one thing that I'm very proud of about Scotland is, through merit and through no other reason, right at the moment, every single one of our main political parties in Scotland, all three of the main parties, the government, the opposition, and the secondary opposition party in Scotland, are led by women. And I think this is the time. This is the time for people of my age and younger, where we always just kind of thought it would get better for women, to realise that that doesn't happen by itself, and we have to go out and claim it. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to be here today, and I wanted to speak to you, because we can claim this. This is our time. Thank you.
Thank you. Good note to end on. Thank you.